The dining room at Ashvale House held 26 candles, and Eleanor Vane had counted every one. She had counted them 3 times across the course of the evening, not from nerves, but from habit, the habit of a woman who had learned that precision was the only defense available to her kind. She stood at the sideboard in her livery, her shoulders squared beneath the borrowed coat, her hair pinned so tightly beneath the powdered wig that her scalp ached in a low and steady way she had stopped noticing. The coat was too broad across the chest. She had bound herself flat for that, too, and she breathed in shallow installments the way she had been breathing for 6 weeks. At the head of the table, Edward Cavendish, the Duke of Ashvale, reached for his glass. Eleanor moved. She did not think. She crossed the 3 feet of polished floor between the sideboard and the Duke's chair, with a footman's measured pace, and she set her white-gloved hand over the rim of the crystal. The room went cold. She heard the Dowager Duchess draw breath. She heard the scrape of Mr. Pruitt's chair at the servants' entrance behind her. She heard the young man beside her, Thomas the kitchen boy, make a small, involuntary sound in his throat. She heard nothing from the Duke of Ashvale himself, and that silence was its own country. "Do not drink that, your grace," she said. Her voice came out level. She had practiced that too. The Duke's eyes moved from the glass to her face in the way of a man accustomed to reading rooms. She watched him register the glove over the rim. She watched something sharpen in his expression, something that was not anger and not surprise, and was entirely unreadable to her beyond its quality of attention. "Remove your hand," said Lady Dorothea Cavendish from the far end of the table, in the particular tone of a woman who had never been contradicted and intended to ensure the record remained intact. Eleanor did not remove her hand. The Duke did not lift the glass. The room went on holding its breath around them, 26 candles burning without a flicker, and she stood where she was and understood that what happened in the next 30 seconds would determine everything she had come here to do. Every early morning she had spent memorizing the inventory ledgers. Every evening she had spent in a coat 2 sizes too large. Every night she had lain on a narrow mattress in the servants' hall and thought of her father's handwriting and the quiet precision of his life and what the world had done with it. She had been building toward this moment for 6 weeks, and she would not flinch now. She had not always been a footman. She had not always been anything as useful. Until the autumn of the previous year, Eleanor had been the daughter of Mr. Dauntree, Henry Vane of Cheapside Apothecary, a quiet man of meticulous habit and ink-stained fingers, who had spent 30 years compounding medicines for the families of London with a care that bordered on devotion. She had grown up among the bottles, among the dried herbs and the careful handwritten labels, and the smell of camphor and dried lavender, and the faint astringency that clung to her father's coat. She had learned to read, from that same coat, the difference between a preparation that healed and one that harmed, and she had understood early that the difference was almost entirely a matter of proportion. Her father had been called to Ashvale House in the autumn of the previous year, summoned by the then Duke's physician to assist with an obscure compound requested for a digestive complaint. He had gone as he always went, without ceremony. He had compounded what was asked. He had returned home. 3 weeks later, the then Duke was dead, and by the following morning, Henry Vane's name was in every newspaper in London as the most probable instrument of it. He died in Newgate 6 months after that, not from the law's sentence, for there was no conviction, but from the cold and the shame and the simple failure of a body that had already given everything it had. Eleanor had held his hand at the end. She had read the verdict on his face before the jury had returned one, which was that the world had decided he was guilty, and the world's decision, once rendered, was very nearly impossible to appeal. She had spent the following months doing what her father had always taught her to do, with a problem she could not solve from the outside. She had worked her way inside it. She had known from the beginning that the Duke of the previous year was not the first man to die in Ashvale House under circumstances that a careful eye might find instructive. She had spent 3 months in the reading rooms of 3 separate lending libraries and the offices of 2 solicitors, who had no reason to know why she was asking before she had the full picture assembled to her satisfaction. She had found 3 other names across the last decade, men who had sat at that dining table, men whose estates or claims bore some relation to the house's inheritance, men whose physicians had noted a slow and baffling decline without ever finding an adequate cause. Her father had been the apothecary closest to hand, and the closest apothecary to hand was also the most convenient explanation. She had presented herself to the Asheville housekeeper, Mrs. Casas Calm. Gaskell 6 weeks before the scene at the table, with a reference she had written herself on forged stationery, and a manner composed of the small, careful confidences she had spent weeks observing in the footman she had watched from the street. She was tall for a woman and slight for a man, but she had disguised herself with the precision that had always been her inheritance from her father, and Mrs. Gaskell, who was a woman of practical intelligence and a shortage of reliable staff, had engaged her on a month's trial without any apparent suspicion. She had been wrong to do so in every conventional sense. Eleanor was grateful for the wrongness. She had 2 months to prove her father's name, and she intended to use every day of them. Below stairs at Asheville House was a world arranged with the same precision as the world above it, governed by a hierarchy as rigid and self-serious as anything Eleanor had observed in a drawing room. The butler, Mr. Doring, Hatch, ruled the upper servants. Mr. Pruitt, the steward, ruled the accounts and the wine cellar and, in ways that Eleanor began to identify within her first week, considerably more than that. She had heard the first voicing of it on her 3rd day. She had been carrying a tray of cleaning cloths along the passage from the linen room when she heard Pruitt speaking to one of the upper footmen in the room beyond. The door stood ajar, not enough to show her, enough to carry sound. Mrs. Gaskell's latest charity case, Pruitt said. Did you know where she found him? The agency on Vine Street, no references I could verify, and a look about him I cannot place. The apothecaries get, I shouldn't wonder. They breed a particular sort, fond of bottles and asking questions about what's in them. Eleanor did not stop walking. She distributed the cloths. She returned the tray. She stood in the linen room for precisely the count of 12, and then she went back to work. She had been asking questions about what was in the bottles, and she had been doing it carefully in the way her father had taught her, observing rather than inquiring, watching the wine cellar's inventory against the household ledger, and noting where they did not agree. She had found the first discrepancy in her 2nd week, a small quantity of a particular compound not native to any wine cellar she had ever heard of, listed in a supplier's invoice that Pruitt had left for a single afternoon in his unlocked desk. She had not taken it. She had memorized it. She had spent the intervening weeks building the picture in the way her father had always built his assessments of a difficult case, quietly, methodically, without allowing the conclusions she was drawing to outpace the evidence she had gathered. The picture, when it was complete, was not difficult to understand. The Duke of Asheville rode out each morning at 7:30, and Eleanor had learned within her first fortnight that his path through the house before leaving, invariably, took him past the servants' corridor on the east side, which was not the most direct route to the stables, and therefore suggested that the route was not entirely purposeless. She was polishing a pair of andirons in the corridor one morning when she heard his step, and she did not look up from her work. She had long since understood that the safest way to observe a man without his awareness was to seem entirely occupied. She was aware of him passing. She was aware in the particular way her body had begun to maintain its own record of his presence, of the precise moment his step slowed behind her. He did not speak. She did not look up. She heard him pause for perhaps 4 seconds, and then continue toward the stable yard. 4 seconds. She had measured them against her own heartbeat, which was not a reliable instrument that morning. The dining room had presented its first crisis 3 days before the scene at the table, when Eleanor had managed to be present at the wine cellar during a delivery and had seen, in the quarter second before Pruitt's body blocked her view, the particular bottle that did not match any wine merchant's label she had ever seen. She had noted the position on the shelf. She had noted the time the delivery was made. She had carried the information in the exact place. She carried everything in the quiet back room of her attention, where nothing was written down because nothing written down was safe. She had been in the cellar again the following evening on an errand for Mr. Hatch, when the Duke had appeared at the door. She did not know what had brought him there. She learned later that he had been conducting his own quiet inspection of the accounts, and the cellar had been on his list. What she knew in the moment was that the candle she carried placed her at the far end of a dark stone corridor, and that he had taken the candle from her hand to read the label of a bottle on the shelf above her head, and that in the moment of taking it, his fingers had passed over hers in the dark. She had not moved. He had not moved. The cellar was cold and the candle was very small, and they stood in its light for a moment that Eleanor could not have measured accurately even with a steady pulse. She was aware of the warmth of his hand near her hand. She was aware with a clarity that had nothing to do with thought, and everything to do with the body's own honest record-keeping of exactly how close he was in the dark. He stepped back. He read the label. He handed the candle back. "You may go," he said. His voice was low, its register that of a man accustomed to giving simple instructions and expecting them to be followed. And Eleanor understood, in the way she had learned to understand everything in this house, that the instruction did not entirely contain what had prompted it. She went. She thought about him that night with the objectivity she had been practicing since her first week in the house, which was to say she thought about him with very little objectivity at all and catalogued the failure with the same precision she applied to everything else. It was on the following afternoon in the library that she understood something of his wound. She had been sent to restore a set of volumes from the lower shelf, and she had been working quietly for perhaps 20 minutes when she became aware that the Duke was in the room, standing at the window with his back to her. He had not spoken when he entered. She had assumed he had not noticed her presence, which was the useful assumption to maintain. He stood with his hand at the breast of his coat, a gesture she had seen twice before without understanding it, his fingers resting over the pocket where, she had observed by now, he kept something small and flat. "James," he said very quietly to the window. Not to her. Not to the room. To whoever it was he was still speaking to in the spaces between his daily duties, in the moments he believed himself unobserved. She did not move. She did not breathe at the ordinary rate. He had inherited from a brother named James, who had sat at the head of that same dining table and had drunk from that same decanter and had declined, week by week, with a swiftness that the physicians of the day had attributed to a weakness of the constitution rather than to anything external. Eleanor had known this from her research before she had ever set foot in this house. She had not understood, until this moment, what it looked like from the inside of the grief. He dropped his hand. He turned, and he saw her. She had been seen. She was certain of it from the quality of the recognition that moved across his face, not the professional notice of a duke observing a footman, but the startled recognition of a man who had been somewhere very private and had found someone already there. She did not look away. She had made that choice in the first second, and she held it. He said nothing. He left the room. She stood with a volume of Cowper in her hands and understood that she had just been given something, and that she did not yet have a name for it. The crisis came from two directions at once, as crises had a habit of doing in Eleanor's experience. The first direction was Pruitt. He had been watching her for days. She had understood that from his particular quality of silence in her vicinity, a silence that was not the silence of disinterest, but of assessment. He came to her in the linen room on a Tuesday morning, with the particular manner of a man who had something to offer and was confident the offer would be accepted. "You have been asking questions," he said, "about the wine cellar inventory." She had not, in any way that could be documented. She said so. "You have been doing something near enough to it," he said. "I am willing to overlook it, in exchange for a small consideration, discretion, let us call it. Whatever you believe you have found nothing. Say so, and there is £10 in it for you." She said nothing, for long enough that he took her silence for negotiation. 20 then?" "No," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had not expected that, and then he left. She stood in the linen room and understood that she had perhaps 3 days before he found a way to make her position untenable. She had enough. She had almost enough. She needed to act. It was the Duke himself who found her in the passage an hour later. Not by design, or not by any design she could identify. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she saw him. The passage was narrow, and the light from the east window was in her face. "You have something to tell me," he said. It was not a question. She understood for the first time that he had been watching her as she had been watching him, and that his eyes had been rather more accurate than she had wanted them to be. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with those eyes that had seen his brother die in a house where the culprit was still present, and had concluded that his own perception was the instrument that had failed him. She watched him decide something. "Come to the library at 9 o'clock, he said. "Bring whatever you have." She came at 9 o'clock, with everything she had committed to memory, which was considerable. She had sat across a library table from the Duke of Ashvale and told him in plain language what she believed, what she had observed, and what it meant. She had expected him to dismiss her. She had expected him to be angry. She had expected him to have her removed from the house on the grounds that a footman with an apothecary's knowledge and a month's worth of memorized inventory records was a more dangerous problem than whatever she was alleging. He had listened. He had not interrupted. He had listened with the particular quality of a man who had been waiting for someone to tell him the truth about his own house and had not known how to ask. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Your name," he said, "is not what you gave Mrs. Gaskell. It was not a question either." "No, Your Grace," she said. "What is your name?" "Eleanor Vane," she said. "My father was Henry Vane, apothecary, who was accused of poisoning your predecessor." The silence that followed was the longest she had endured in 6 weeks of silences. "I know your father's name," he said. "Then you know what was said of him." "I know what was said." He looked at her across the table, and she understood that what he was doing was the most difficult thing he knew how to do, which was to trust what he saw. "Tell me what you believe is true." "That he was innocent," she said. "That the pattern began before him, and that the compound in your cellar has been administered across more than one occasion, and that you have been receiving it in small doses for the last month at minimum, and that if you drink from the decanter set out for you tonight, you will continue to receive it." He stood. He walked to the window. He stood with his hand at his breast pocket, the gesture she had come to recognize. "Eleanor," he said. And her name in his voice was not the name a duke gave a servant. It was the name a man gave something he was not ready to give a name to. She did not answer. She did not look away. He turned from the window. He came back to the table and he stood at the far end of it, which was close enough that the candle between them lit his face unevenly, one side bright, one side in the shadow. He had been living in since his brother died. "I do not want to lose you from this house," he said. "Not for duty. For something I have no right to name yet." She sat with her hands flat on the table and her breath very steady and said, "I may not be in a position to remain." "I know," he said, "not tonight. What I want you to understand before whatever happens tomorrow is that I understand what you have given me, what it cost you to come here." She held his gaze for a long time across the candle and the table and the distance that was not distance. And she said, "Your brother deserved better than what this house gave him." "He did," he said. "So did your father." She was at the door of the library when she paused. Neither of them moved for the count of 7 seconds, which she counted in the only way she could, which was in her own pulse, and she understood that the hesitation was the truest thing she had done in this house. Then she went to her room, and she lay on her narrow bed, and she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about the morning. The morning arrived with Pruitt. He had not waited 3 days. He had found it necessary, apparently, to speak to Lady Dorothea Cavendish the previous evening, after Eleanor's conversation with him in the linen room, and by morning the conclusions had been drawn. Mrs. Gaskell found Eleanor in the servants' hall at 7:30. with a look on her face that Eleanor understood at once. "Her ladyship's maid has been making inquiries." "Mrs. Blank," Gaskill said, in the low, careful voice of a woman who had been protecting her staff by instinct for 30 years and was not certain she could protect this one. "She says her ladyship has described the new footman as the apothecaries get come to spy on the household. She says it in the corridor, loud enough to be heard." Eleanor received this without visible response. "She knows, Mrs. Ike," Gaskill said, "or she suspects enough that it amounts to the same thing. She will bring it to his grace at dinner." Eleanor nodded. She folded her hands on the table. "There is something I need you to do for me," she said to Mrs. Gaskill. "I need you to send for Dr. Augustine Vale and ask him to be present in the dining room this evening. Tell him the Duke's physician is needed. Do not tell him more than that." Mrs. Gaskill looked at her for a long moment. "You are a woman," she said, which was not precisely a revelation at this point, but felt like one in the saying of it. "Yes," said Eleanor. "You are Henry Vane's daughter." "Yes, Mrs. Ghana." Gaskill sat with this for 3 measured seconds, and then she stood. "I will send for Dr. Vale," she said, and left. Eleanor went to her room. She changed into her own dress, the plain gray wool she had arrived in, pressing out the creases with her palms, in the absence of anything better. She unpinned her hair and pinned it again, in the only way she knew how, which was neatly and without ornament. She picked up her father's pharmacopoeia from beneath the mattress and held it for a moment, the soft, worn leather, the pages he had filled in the handwriting she had been reading since she was 3 years old. She put it back. She went downstairs and waited. The dinner that evening was set for 8 o'clock, and Eleanor entered the dining room from the servant's door at 5 minutes to, which was her right as a footman. Lady Dorothea Cavendish arrived at the table at 3 minutes past, with her lady's companion and a visiting baronet. Eleanor did not know. The baronet sat at the Duke's right hand. The companion sat across from him. Whoa! Dorothea arranged herself at the far end of the table with the precision of a woman who had been managing seating arrangements since before Eleanor was born. Dr. Vale arrived at 10 minutes past without announcement, and stationed himself near the sideboard with the expression of a man who had received an unusual request and was experienced enough to follow it without asking all his questions at once. The Duke came in last. He looked at Eleanor once, the held look, and then he took his seat. Pruett poured the wine. Thomas carried the tray to the Duke's chair. Eleanor crossed the floor. Lady Dorothea's voice cut across the room at the precise moment Eleanor's hand covered the glass. "Your Grace," she said, "I must speak plainly, since no one else appears willing. That person is not a footman. That person is a woman, dressed in livery, who entered this house under false pretenses. She is, I have determined with certainty, the daughter of the apothecary, your brother's physicians, identified as the most probable cause of the late Duke's death. She is the apothecary's get, come here for reasons I would not like to speculate on in present company, and she ought to be removed from your house immediately." The room was very still. The Duke looked at his glass. He looked at Eleanor's hand over the glass. He looked at Eleanor's face. "Dr. Vale," he said. The physician crossed to the table. "The glass," the Duke said. Val took the glass from beneath Eleanor's hand and carried it to the sideboard, where he held it to the candlelight with the expression of a man whose nose and 30 years of medical practice were doing rapid and competent work. "Arsenic," he said after a moment. He set the glass down with a care that communicated the word's weight more precisely than any volume could have done. "A quantity consistent with the pattern I should have recognized in the late Duke's decline. I did not recognize it then." He paused. "I recognize it now." The room did not go cold. It went very still, which was different, a stillness with a kind of weight to it. The stillness of 26 candles burning in a room where something that had been hidden for a long time had just become visible to everyone present. Lady Dorothea Cavendish said, "This is absurd." Her companion looked at her. The baronet looked at his own glass. Pruett, at the servants' door, did not move. The Duke of Ashvale rose from his chair. He crossed the room in 4 measured strides, and he came to stand beside Eleanor, not behind her, not apart from her, but beside her. And the room felt that placement in the way rooms feel, the movements of the people who carry their authority most completely. "She is under my protection," he said. "Every word she has spoken is true." 12 words, level, irrevocable. Lady Dorothea began to speak. The baronet set down his fork. "From the sideboard, Dr. Radd. Utter sept." Vale folded his hands and watched the room settle into the knowledge of what had just been publicly committed. And Eleanor understood, standing beside the Duke of Ashvale with the remnants of her disguise still on her in the form of the livery coat she had not had time to change out of, that this was the moment her father had spent 6 months in Newgate, waiting to be given by someone with the power to give it. She did not weep. She had his precision, if not his luck, and she held herself straight. The subsequent hour was procedural in the way that only certain hours can be. Pruett was confined to the steward's room. Lady Dorothea was escorted to her chambers by 2 footmen, who had that morning served under her absolute authority, and now served under something different. Dr. Vale composed a statement at the sideboard table with the methodical calm of a man who had been waiting 30 years for the correct opportunity to revise a professional error. The baronet departed before the port was poured, which was perhaps the wisest thing anyone did that evening, Mrs. Twan, when Sachs. Gaskill appeared from the servants' door at some point during all of this, with a look on her face that Eleanor could not read precisely, though she would have described it afterward if pressed, as the look of a woman who had suspected something for 6 weeks, and had just had the suspicion resolved in the most dramatic fashion available. Eleanor stood at the sideboard while the room reorganized itself around what had just been established, and she was very tired, in the particular way that comes not from the work itself, but from the sustained private effort of doing the work without allowing anyone to see it being done. She was still standing there when the Duke returned to her. The room was empty by then, or nearly. Dr. Vale had withdrawn. The footman had cleared. The candles were burning lower. He came to stand before her, at a distance that was not the distance of a duke and a servant, and he looked at her face in the same way he had looked at it in the library, the way of a man who had learned to distrust what he saw, and was making a deliberate effort to trust it again. "You are exhausted," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "Are you going to use that address indefinitely, or is it a habit you intend to keep out of stubbornness?" She looked at him. Something in her chest, which had been very carefully wound for 6 weeks, began, very slowly, to loosen. "I am not entirely certain what else to call you." "My name is Edward," he said. "You have used it without knowledge of its application. I have heard you do it." She had, once, in the cellar, in her own mind, in the dark. She had not known she had been heard. "You will stay," he said. Not a question. Not a command. Or not only a command. Or something in between. The kind of sentence that has a request inside the architecture of a directive which she had come to recognize as the particular grammar of a man who did not know how to ask simply for things he needed. "I have nowhere else to go," she said. "My father's house was surrendered for the debts the accusation produced." "That is not," he said carefully, "the answer I was asking for." The candles were very low. The dining room was empty. She was a woman in a footman's coat, with her hair coming loose at one side, and she had just performed the most significant act of her life, and she was standing in front of a man whose perception had reached her before she had given him permission to reach her. "Yes," she said, "I will stay." He did not move. She did not move. The held moment stretched between them with the quality of something that was preparing to become something else. And then he lifted his hand and he drew a loose strand of hair away from her face with the side of his fingers. The smallest possible gesture, the most private, the only one available to them in this room. "Good," he said. "Go and sleep." She went. But she slept for the first time in weeks, without the particular vigilance that had been her constant companion in Ashvale House, and when she woke in the gray morning to the sound of the household beginning its ordinary day, she lay still for a long time, and allowed herself to believe that the day was, in fact, ordinary. It was not. It was the beginning of days that could be, which is a different and in some ways more important thing than ordinary. The papers arrived in the second week of December, when the frost had laid itself across the grounds of Ashvale House in the early mornings, and the fires were kept burning later and later into the evening. Dr. Vale had submitted his formal testimony. A solicitor from Lincoln's Inn had been in correspondence with the Duke's steward, the new one, a quiet man from the Derbyshire estate who had nothing to do with anything that had preceded him. The record of Henry Vane's association with the house, and with the compound that had been found in the wine cellar, and with the death of the previous Duke, had been formally reviewed and formally set aside. Eleanor was in the small sitting room off the east corridor. When the Duke brought them to her, he was not in the habit yet of coming to her without announcement, though she had begun to understand that the habit was forming. He came in with the papers folded in his hand, and he sat in the chair across from her, rather than standing, which was the thing he did when he was treating the conversation as an exchange between equals, rather than between himself and the room. He put the papers on the table between them. She looked at them. She looked at his face. "It is done," he said. "His name is restored." She did not speak for a moment. She placed her hand flat on the papers, her palm over her father's name, written there in the formal round hand of a solicitor's clerk. He reached across the table, and he set something else beside the papers. Her father's pharmacopoeia. She looked up. "Mrs. Gaskell found it under your mattress," he said. "She thought you should have it properly. She also said to tell you that in 30 years of service, she has never had a footman who could identify arsenic by the smell of a glass at 3 feet, and that she considers this a distinction rather than a liability." Eleanor looked at the small, worn book. Her father's name was on the inside cover in his own hand, the handwriting she had been able to read since she was 3 years old. Below it in the same hand, he had written a single line that she had read so many times it had become the interior monologue of her childhood. "The measure of a preparation is not in its power, but in its precision." She picked up the book and held it, and the room was warm, and the fire was burning behind her, and the frost was on the grounds outside. "Thank you," she said. The words were insufficient for what she meant by them, but he seemed to understand the full accounting of it, regardless in the way he had come to understand her since the library, since the cellar, since the dining room, since the moment he had learned to trust what he saw. "I intend to make your father's situation very publicly known," he said. "The nature of what occurred, the identity of those responsible, and the conduct of the person who identified it. You may find the public account inconvenient. I have been inconvenienced before. You have." His mouth moved in the small, precise way that was the closest he came, still, to a smile. "I intend also to make another matter publicly known, at the earliest appropriate occasion. I thought it correct to tell you in advance, since it concerns you materially." She waited. "I'm going to ask you to remain in this house," he said. "Not in the capacity you arrived in, and not as anything you arrived without choosing." Outside the window, a first thin snow had begun, barely visible against the gray sky. More a quality of the light than a weather event. She watched it for a moment. "You trust what you see," she said. "You did not once, you do now." "I had good instruction," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire was at her back. The pharmacopoeia was in her hands. The snow was at the window, and the house was quiet around them, in the way of a house that had expelled something from itself, and was breathing more easily for the absence of it. "Yes," she said, which answered both what he had said and what he had not yet said but was about to. And he seemed to understand that too. The snow thickened through the afternoon, and by evening it lay in a thin white sheet across the grounds of Ashvale House, over the stone paths and the frozen rose arbor and the gravel of the drive. Eleanor stood at the window of the small sitting room after the lamps were lit, and watched it settle. Behind her, the fire crackled in the way of fires that had decided to be generous, and from the corridor she could hear Mrs. Boo, Gaskell's voice directing the evening's arrangements in the tone of a woman who had recently witnessed something enormous and had filed it away, under the heading of things that make the work worthwhile. She had her father's book in her hand, and inside the cover, tucked between the pages, were the papers with his name on them. She thought of him in the way she had allowed herself to think of him only rarely since his death, which was not with grief, or not only with grief, but with the particular clarity of a woman who has finally given back what was taken from someone she loved. She thought of his hands, precise and gentle and ink-stained. She thought of what he had always said about the difference between a compound that healed and one that harmed, and she thought that precision, applied to the right purpose, was also a kind of love. The snow was still falling when Edward came to stand beside her at the window. He did not speak at once. He was not a man who spoke into silences, unless he had something to put there. She had come to understand this, too. "James would have liked you," he said. At last she did not answer immediately. She thought of a man who had sat at the head of the dining table and had drunk from a glass that someone in his own household had ensured would be his last, and she thought of his brother standing at a window, saying his name quietly to the glass. "I think," she said, "that he would have liked anyone who was paying attention." He looked at her profile in the lamplight. She felt him looking, which she always felt in the way her body had simply accepted as a fact about itself. "He would have," he said. The snow fell. The fire burned. She stood in the window of Ashvale House with her father's book in her hands and her father's name restored to the record, and the warmth of the man beside her reached her through the cold of the evening, the way warmth from a good fire reaches even the furthest corner of a room, steadily and without announcement, until the cold is no longer the dominant fact. She understood, holding the pharmacopoeia, that the measure of what she had done was not in the power of it, but in the precision, exactly as her father had taught her. And that precision, in the end, was a form of love, and love was a form of the only justice that had ever meant anything to her. If her father's quiet, steady work moved you this evening, leave a thought in the comments and thank you for staying until the end.